The plow blade screams against something hard. A jolt rips through the steering wheel, up her arms, into her teeth. 40 acres of Kentucky stretch out behind her, gold in the morning light, the kind of land that has been farmed and forgotten, and farmed again for 120 years. The kind of land that is not supposed to have any metal in it at all. She kills the engine. She climbs down into the dirt, pulls off one glove, brushes the soil back with her bare hand. Cold the way a headstone is cold. Cold the way iron is cold even in July. She brushes more dirt away. The shape under her palm keeps getting bigger, curved, riveted, black with rust. 640 miles from the nearest ocean, and she has not even reached the chain yet. The plow caught something hard. Emily Moore felt it before she heard it, a jolt up the steering column, into her arms, into her teeth. The kind of vibration that meant metal had kissed metal somewhere down in a field that wasn't supposed to have any metal in it at all. She killed the engine. The morning went quiet in the way mornings only go quiet on a Kentucky farm in late spring. A crow, the tick of a hot tractor cooling. Nothing else. She climbed down, boots in the dirt, knees popping the way they'd been popping ever since Boston, ever since the divorce, ever since she'd packed up everything she owned and pointed a U-Haul south on I-65. She knelt. She brushed the dirt back with her glove, then with her bare hand, because the glove was clumsy, and because something about the moment made her want to feel it for herself. Cold. Cold the way iron is cold even in summer. Cold the way a headstone is cold under your palm at a graveside. Emily pulled her hand back. She didn't know yet that her grandmother had spent 70 years waiting for someone to find this. She didn't know yet that her mother had spent 40 years praying nobody ever would. She just knew the thing under her glove was cold, and that it shouldn't be there, so she stood up, walked back to the tractor, got the small spade out of the toolbox, and started to dig. 3 months earlier, she had been a 30-year-old accountant in a 6th floor walk-up in Alston, with a husband who had stopped looking at her, and a job that had stopped looking at her too. Both events on roughly the same Tuesday in March, a year she would later refer to, when she could refer to it at all, as the year the ground gave out. The husband was Kyle. The job was at a mid-size firm on Boylston Street. The apartment was leased in both their names. The framed photograph of her grandmother over the radiator was hers. The plants were hers. The dog was Kyle's mother's. Everything else was up for grabs. The photograph showed a woman in a cotton dress standing in front of a Kentucky farmhouse. Black and white, faded at the corners. The woman wasn't smiling. She wasn't sad either. She was looking at the camera the way some women look at cameras when they have decided not to give the camera what it came for. Emily had been 8 years old the last time she had seen that woman in person. The woman in the photograph was Emily's grandmother, Shirley Allen. She had died 3 months before Kyle moved out, alone, in a hospital bed in Henderson County, Kentucky, 640 miles from her only daughter and her only granddaughter, neither of whom had come. Emily had not gone to the funeral. Her mother, Brenda Wright, had not gone either. It was the kind of thing they did not discuss. There was a long list of those. So when the letter arrived from a small-town lawyer in Kentucky, telling her that her late grandmother had left her the farmhouse, the barn, the 40 acres around them, probate already cleared, her name on the deed, Emily had read the letter twice, poured a glass of cheap wine, called her mother. The conversation lasted 11 seconds. "Sell it, Emily. Mom, I haven't even. Sell it. Take the money. Move on with your life." The line went dead. Emily had stared at her phone for a long time. Then she had looked up at the framed photograph above the radiator. The woman in the cotton dress had looked back at her with the same expression she had been looking at the camera with for 80 years. The expression of someone who had decided what she would and would not give. Emily had not sold the farm. She had packed the U-Haul, loaded the framed photograph last, driven 640 miles south, and arrived in Henderson County, Kentucky, on a Tuesday in late April with 3 suitcases, a box of books, and absolutely no plan beyond the next 48 hours. That had been 6 weeks ago. The farmhouse was worse than the photograph had let on. The clapboard was peeling in long, pale curls. The porch sagged at the south end. The kitchen smelled like a place that had finished its conversation with the world. There was a deer skull on the mantel that Emily could not remember ever being there as a child, and nobody alive could tell her about it. She had spent the first week scrubbing, the second week patching screens, the third week trying to remember how to drive a tractor she had last touched at age 7. Her grandmother's tractor. An old Ford 8N with a clutch that fought back. By week 4, she could plow a passable furrow without grinding the gears. By week 5, she had met Edward Harris. Edward Harris lived in the small white house at the bend in the gravel road. He was 78 years old. He walked with the slow, weighted gait of a man who had spent his whole life lifting things heavier than he should have. Pale blue eyes set deep, a jaw that suggested he had said no to a great many things over a great many years and meant it every time. He had come up to the fence on a Thursday afternoon, while Emily was sorting through the rusted implements in the barn. He leaned on the fence post for a long time before he spoke. Long enough that Emily had started to wonder if he was going to speak at all. "You look like her." That was all. He had turned and walked back to his own porch before Emily had figured out how to answer. She had been thinking about that sentence ever since. Now, 6 weeks into Kentucky, and approximately 3 minutes into the discovery of something in the ground that should not have been in the ground, Emily set the small spade aside and walked back to the barn for a bigger one. The bigger spade was her grandmother's, worn handle, initials carved into the wood with what looked like a pocket knife. S.A. for Shirley Allen. Emily had stared at those initials for a long minute the first day she had found the tool, and then she had carried it back to the porch and leaned it against the railing the way you lean a thing that matters. She brought it out now, walked back to the disturbed earth, and dug. The dirt came up in heavy black clods, sweet and a little sour, old in the way a root cellar is old. She worked the spade around the edge of whatever the metal thing was, widening the circle, taking off the top layer first, the way her father had taught her once on a vegetable patch in a Boston suburb when she was 9, the year before he died. She didn't think about her father much, most days. She wasn't thinking about him now. She was thinking about how the metal kept getting bigger. At first she had assumed it was as a stone, a buried boulder her grandmother had farmed around for decades, the kind of thing the limestone country was full of. Except stone wasn't cold like this. Stone wasn't smooth like this. Stone didn't have rivets. Emily sat back on her heels. The thing in the dirt had rivets in it. Rivets the size of her thumb, black with rust, set in a curving plate of iron that arced down into the earth in a direction her shovel couldn't follow. She brushed more dirt away with her hand, found the edge of another plate, found the seam where the two plates met. She kept digging. She dug for 3 hours. She forgot lunch, forgot water, forgot the email she was supposed to send to the unemployment office in Massachusetts, and the bill she was supposed to call about, and the fact that her phone was ringing somewhere in the cab of the tractor. By 2 in the afternoon, she had cleared a circle 8 feet across. The thing in the ground had a shape now. The shape was not a shape that belonged on a farm in Kentucky. It was the shape of an anchor. A real anchor, a ship's anchor. The kind of anchor that hung from the bow of a freighter the size of a city block. It was enormous. The fluke alone was bigger than the hood of her truck. The shank disappeared down into the earth at an angle her shovel could not follow without machinery she did not own. Emily stood up. She walked a slow circle around the thing she had just uncovered, put her hands on her hips, took them off, put them back, thought, with the kind of clarity that only arrives when the brain has stopped trying to make sense of anything, the following sentence: "This is not a thing. This is the beginning of a thing." Because the shank went down and forward into the eastern corner of her property. The corner her grandmother had not farmed in 7 decades. The corner Edward Harris had warned her about across the fence post that afternoon, when he had told her she looked like her grandmother and then walked away. The corner everyone in town called Quiet Acre, and from the base of the shank, just visible at the bottom of the pit she had dug, ran a chain. The links were as thick as her wrist, black with corrosion. They went somewhere. Emily Moore stood in the middle of the field. Her grandmother had left her, and thought, for the first time since she had put Boston in the rearview mirror, that maybe her mother had been right. Maybe she should have sold. The thing she didn't do that afternoon was tell anyone. She didn't call her mother. She didn't call Nicole Wilson, her best friend from Boston, who had been leaving voicemails for 6 weeks, and had stopped leaving them about a week ago. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't call the County Historical Society. She didn't call anyone. She walked back to the farmhouse, washed the dirt off her hands in the kitchen sink, poured a glass of bourbon from the bottle her grandmother had left in the cabinet over the refrigerator. A bottle Emily had been afraid to touch for 6 weeks. She drank half of it standing at the counter. Then she went up to the attic. The attic was where she had been avoiding for 6 weeks. The attic was where her grandmother's life still was. The attic was where the trunk was. The trunk Emily had found on her second day in the house, and had not opened because there was no key. And because Emily had not had the heart, in those first weeks, to break the lock on something her grandmother had clearly wanted. Closed, she climbed the narrow stairs. The attic smelled like cedar and old paper, and the particular dust that gathers on things that have been still for a very long time. The trunk was where she had left it. Brass corners, leather straps, a small padlock at the front, blackened with age, the keyhole shaped like a teardrop turned on its side. Emily sat on the floor in front of it. She did not break the lock yet. She sat there, and she looked at it. And she said out loud, to no one, in a voice that surprised her with how quiet it was, "What did you leave me, Grandma?" The attic did not answer. The attic, Emily was beginning to understand, was never going to answer. The attic was a place where answers had been stored. Possibly. But the answers had been stored on the assumption that someone would arrive who already knew the questions. And Emily did not know the questions. Because nobody in her family had told her the questions. Because everyone who had known the questions had agreed, somewhere along the way, that the questions were better left unasked. She went back downstairs. She drank the second half of the bourbon. She slept that night with the bedroom window open, and in her dreams she saw a young woman in a cotton dress standing at the edge of a cornfield in the rain, holding the hand of a man in a navy uniform she had never seen before, neither of them speaking, the rain coming down hard enough to flatten the grass at their feet, and somewhere behind them, half buried in the mud at the edge of the field, the curving black shape of an anchor. She woke at 4 in the morning. She lay in the dark for a long time before she got up. Edward Harris was at the fence again the next morning. He was holding a paper grocery bag in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. He set both down on the top rail when he saw Emily come out of the house. He waited for her to walk across the yard. He waited for her to reach the fence. He waited a few seconds longer than necessary after she had reached the fence. The way a man waits when he is trying to decide whether he is going to say what he came over to say. "Brought you these tomato starts. Figured you might be wanting to get them in before the heat." "Thank you." He nodded at the bag. "Didn't look at her. Saw your tractor sitting in the east field last night. You doing some clearing over there?" Emily felt her shoulders settle a quarter inch. She did not move otherwise, just turning it over. Edward Harris was quiet for a long moment. "That corner there? That corner there? The one your grandmother never touched?" "Yes." He finally looked at her. The pale blue eyes were not unkind. They were also not warm. They were the eyes of a man who had spent a long time deciding how much truth he was allowed to hand to other people and how much he was supposed to keep for himself. "Your grandmother had her reasons? What were they?" "I'm not the one to tell you that, Emily." "Who is?" He picked up his thermos, held it for a moment without unscrewing the cap, looked out across her field, past the barn, past the line where the grass got tall, toward the corner where the tractor still sat parked at an angle in the dirt with the spade leaning against the rear wheel. "Maybe nobody is." He walked back to his own house. Emily watched him go. She watched until his front door closed behind him. She picked up the bag of tomato starts and the thermos he had forgotten, and she carried both back to her porch and set them down. She sat on the top step. She stared at the eastern corner of her property. She did not move for a long time. Then she walked back to the field. She walked all the way to the edge of the pit she had dug the day before. She stood at the rim and looked down at the curve of black iron, half buried in Kentucky soil 640 miles from the nearest ocean. She said, out loud to the anchor, "Who put you here?" The anchor did not answer. The chain at the base of the shank gleamed dully where she had cleared the dirt away from it. It ran east, east toward the tall grass, east toward the woods at the far edge of her property, east toward the part of the farm her grandmother had not walked in 70 years. Emily Moore went home and broke the padlock on the trunk that night. She broke it with a hammer and a flathead screwdriver from the toolbox in the kitchen. It took longer than she had thought it would. The lock was older than the house, possibly, and it did not want to surrender. When it finally gave, it gave with a sharp metallic crack that sounded, in the silence of the attic, like a small bone breaking. Emily opened the lid. The smell came up first, cedar and rose water, and the faint chemical ghost of something that might once have been perfume, or might once have been the powder women used to put in their handkerchiefs in 1944. Underneath that, paper. A lot of paper. She lifted the top layer out one piece at a time, a small Navy insignia, tarnished brass, a folded American flag, the small kind that came home with the body, or in place of the body. When the body could not be sent, a bundle of letters tied with a blue silk ribbon. The ribbon had been blue once. It was the color of pale sky now. Faded by decades of being wound around the same small bundle of envelopes, a black and white photograph in a paper sleeve. Emily took the photograph out of the sleeve. The photograph showed a young woman, maybe 18 years old. Standing in front of a Kentucky farmhouse Emily recognized as the one she was sitting inside of at that exact moment. The woman was wearing a cotton dress. She was looking at the camera with that expression Emily knew so well from the framed picture above the radiator in Alston. The not smiling, not sad expression. But the woman in this photograph was not alone. Next to her, his arm around her waist, was a man in a Navy uniform. Tall, dark-haired, maybe 19, maybe 20. He was looking at the woman beside him with the kind of look that Emily had seen in approximately 4 photographs in the entire course of her life and had never once seen directed at her, including by her husband on the day of her wedding. Emily turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting Emily did not recognize but somehow already loved, was written Shirley and Jonathan. September 1944. Forever. Emily sat on the floor of her grandmother's attic with the photograph in her hands and read those words 6 times in a row. She did not know anyone in her family named Jonathan. She had never heard her grandmother mention anyone named Jonathan. Her grandfather's name had been Robert Allen, a quiet farmer who had died of pneumonia in 1971 when Emily's mother was 3 years old. And as far as Emily had ever known, Robert Allen had been the only man in Shirley Allen's life, forever. Forever was a strong word. Emily reached for the bundle of letters tied with the blue silk ribbon. She untied the ribbon with hands that were not quite steady. The bow had been tied carefully, a long time ago, by fingers that had known what they were doing and had meant what they were doing to last. The ribbon came loose. The letters fell open into her lap. There were 19 of them. She counted twice to be sure. The envelopes were all addressed to Miss Shirley Marie Allen, Rural Route 2, Henderson County, Kentucky. Return address on every envelope was a string of letters and numbers Emily recognized vaguely as the format the United States Navy had used to mail letters home from ships at sea during the war. She picked up the letter on top of the stack. She did not open it. She held it in both hands, and she sat on the floor of her grandmother's attic, and she looked at the date on the postmark, September 8, 1944, 1 week before the night Edward Harris would not talk about. 1 week before, whatever had happened in the eastern corner of the property her grandmother had not farmed for 70 years. 1 week before the storm that the old men in the general store in town still mentioned the way old men mentioned things they had been told not to mention. Emily slid the letter out of the envelope. The paper was thin, onion skin thin, the kind of paper boys had used to write home from the war, because every ounce mattered when you were sending mail across an ocean. The handwriting was small and crowded and confident. My dearest Shirley, the letter began. The orders came down this afternoon. I cannot tell you where we are going. I am not even certain I am supposed to know where we are going. But I can tell you this. The ship is turning. We are turning, Shirley, and we are turning inland, which I would have told you a month ago could not happen, and which is happening now anyway. I do not understand it. The men do not understand it. The captain does not look like a man who understands it either. But we are turning, and the chart in the wardroom shows a course that ends not at any port I have ever heard of, but at a railhead in a state I will not name in this letter, for reasons I think you will understand. If the course holds, my darling, I will be close enough to you to walk to your father's farm in less than a day. I do not know yet whether I will be allowed to, but I will try. Wait for me. Yours always and forever, Jonathan. Emily read the letter once, then again. Then she set it down on the attic floor and pressed her palms against her eyes and sat very still for a long minute. Because something was happening behind her eyes that she did not yet have a name for, and she wanted to have a name for it before she let it out. A ship turning inland, a railhead in a state he would not name, less than a day's walk to her grandmother's father's farm. Emily lowered her hands. She looked at the 18 remaining letters tied no longer with their blue silk ribbon. She looked at the photograph of the young woman in the cotton dress and the young man in the Navy uniform standing in front of the very farmhouse she was sitting in now. She looked through the small attic window at the eastern corner of her property, where, half buried in the dirt at the rim of a hole she had dug with her grandmother's spade, the black curve of a ship's anchor was still visible in the last light of the day. She said out loud, to no one, in a voice that was no longer quiet at all, "Jonathan, what did you bring here?" The answer was not going to come from the attic. The answer was going to come from the chain. She folded the letter back into its envelope, set it on top of the bundle. tied the blue silk ribbon back around the stack, with hands that were steadier now than they had been when she had untied it. She closed the lid of the trunk. She stood up in the attic of her grandmother's house, and she said one more thing out loud before she went downstairs to find her phone and stare at it for a long time and not call her mother. She said, "I'm going to follow it. Somewhere in the dark, far across the eastern edge of the property. In the place her grandmother had not walked since the year before Emily's mother was born." Emily could swear she heard, carried on the warm Kentucky wind through the open kitchen window down below, a sound she had never heard in her life and would never forget for the rest of it. The sound of iron links pulled taut against the earth, a chain settling or a chain waking up. Emily Moore stood at the top of the attic stairs in her grandmother's house and listened. The sound did not come again. The wind moved through the trees outside. A whippoorwill called somewhere down by the creek. The house creaked the way old houses creak when the day is finally letting go of its heat. But Emily had heard what she had heard, and she knew, the way you know certain things before you have any business knowing them, that whatever was at the other end of that chain had been waiting for someone in her family to come back. Had been waiting for a very long time, and had finally, after 70 years of silence, decided that she was the one. She went down the stairs. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the lights off and watched the eastern corner of her property through the window until the sky started to gray at the edges. And in the gray hour before sunrise, when the world was holding its breath, the way the world holds its breath right before something old and buried decides it is finally tired of being buried, Emily Moore poured herself a cup of cold coffee from the pot on the counter and made herself a promise out loud in the empty kitchen of the woman she had barely known, Grandma. "I'm going to find him." The kitchen did not answer, but the wind, moving through the open window from the eastern corner of the property, carried with it the faintest smell of rust. And Emily Moore, 30 years old, divorced, unemployed, 6 weeks into a life she had not planned and did not yet understand, picked up her grandmother's spade from where it leaned against the porch and walked out into the first light of morning toward the place where the chain went down into the ground. She did not know yet that the chain ended in a ravine she had never seen, in a wreck nobody in her family had ever named, in a story her grandmother had carried for 70 years and her mother had carried for 40, and that Emily, before the summer was out, would be asked to either carry herself or finally, after 3 generations of women in her family had said nothing, set down for good in front of the entire world. She did not know yet that the man in the Navy photograph was her grandfather, not the grandfather she had been told about, the other one. She did not know any of that yet. She knew only what she knew that morning, that the cold thing under her glove the day before had not been a stone, that her grandmother had left her something, that her mother had been afraid, and that a young man named Jonathan had written 19 letters to a young woman named Shirley in the autumn of 1944 and had ended every one of them with the same word, forever. Emily Moore walked into the eastern corner of her property in the first light of a Kentucky morning and started to dig. She dug for 9 days, alone. No help, no machine but the old Ford 8N and her grandmother's spade, and a pickaxe she had found rusting under a tarp in the barn that she had to sharpen on a whetstone every other morning, because the soil in the eastern corner of the property was the kind of soil that ate edges, 5 meters the first day, 8 the second, 6 the third, because she hit a root system from a black walnut that had been dead for 40 years and still had opinions. The chain went on. It did not behave the way chains were supposed to behave. It did not run straight. It curved. It looped back on itself in places. It dove down hard and then leveled out and then dove again, like something heavy had been dragged across the field, and the men dragging it had been fighting the weight the whole way. And the chain remembered every place they had lost the fight. Emily remembered them too, or imagined she did, which by the 7th day was beginning to amount to the same thing. By the 4th day her hands had blistered through her gloves, and then through the blisters and into a kind of leather of their own making. By the 5th day she had stopped looking at the clock. By the 6th she had stopped answering her phone. By the 7th Nicole Wilson had called 11 times in a row from Boston, and finally left a voicemail that said, in a voice flat with worry, "Emily, honey, I am going to drive down there myself if you don't pick up by Friday. I am not kidding." Emily did not pick up by Friday. She did, on the 8th day, hear a sound that made her stop digging. It was metal on metal, far off, from the woods. Not the chain at her feet. Something else, something further in. Something that rang once, low and dull, like a bell that had forgotten how to be a bell, and then stopped. She stood in the trench with the spade in her hand, and her shirt stuck to her back, and listened. Nothing. Crow, wind, her own breath. She put the spade back in the dirt. She did not stop. At night she read the letters, one a night, like rations. Because there were only 19, and once she read the last one there would not be any more of them ever again. And Emily had been short on things that lasted lately. The third letter described a sunset over an ocean Jonathan would not name. The fifth described a fight Jonathan had picked with a chief petty officer over the quality of the coffee. The seventh described, in passing, that Jonathan's father had been a railroad man in Indiana, that Jonathan himself had grown up listening to the sound of freight cars coupling in the yard behind their house, and that he had joined the Navy in part because he had been afraid that if he stayed in Indiana, he would die in the same town he had been born in, and his life would amount to a series of departures he had only watched from a porch. Emily read that letter twice. She thought about her own apartment in Alston, about Kyle, about the morning her boss had walked into her office on Boylston Street with his hands folded in front of him in that particular way. That meant he had rehearsed what he was going to say. She put the letter back in the envelope. The ninth letter was different. The handwriting was smaller. The lines were closer together. The paper was the same onion skin navy issue, but it had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn through in 3 places, and the whole thing came apart at the seams when she opened it. The ninth letter was dated September 14, 1944, the night before the storm. "My darling," it began, "I am writing this from a place I am not supposed to be writing from, on paper I am not supposed to have, with the lamp turned low because we are running dark tonight and the chief is in a mood. There are things on this ship that should not be on this ship, surely. I am not going to write them down. I am not going to say them out loud, but I have seen them. I have seen the manifest. I have seen the men we have on board who are not sailors. I have seen what those men do at night, when they think no one is watching. If I get to the farm, I will tell you everything. If I do not get to the farm, I want you to know that I tried. I want you to know that I asked questions I should not have asked and read papers I should not have read, and that I am writing this letter on the chance that the writing of it might be the only honest thing I get to do this year. Burn this when you finish reading it. Forever." Jonathan Emily did not burn the letter. Her grandmother had not burned it either. Which meant Shirley Allen had decided, sometime in 1944 or shortly thereafter, that she was going to disobey the only direct instruction the man she loved had ever given her. Emily set the letter down on the kitchen table. She poured a glass of bourbon. She did not drink it. She looked at the letter for a long time. Things on the ship. Men who were not sailors. What those men do at night. She did not call her mother. She wanted to. She did not. On the morning of the 10th day, she drove into town for the first time in a week. Henderson was a small town. The kind of town where the gas station was also the bait shop, and the diner was also where you went to vote. Emily had been in 3 times since she had arrived in April, and in those 3 times she had been registered by the women behind the counter at the post office, and the men in the booth at the diner, and the cashier at the IGA, as the new Allen, which was what they had decided to call her. Even though her name was Moore, she drove in for groceries, coffee, aspirin, bandages for her hands. She came out of the IGA with 2 paper bags and walked into the parking lot, and almost walked straight into a woman she had never seen before. The woman was maybe 75, white hair pinned up in a way that suggested she had been pinning her hair up the same way for 40 years. A pale blue dress that had been ironed, a purse over one arm. She put a hand on Emily's elbow before Emily could step around her. "Honey, I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't, honey. You're Shirley's girl, aren't you?" Emily stopped. "I'm her granddaughter." The woman nodded. The hand on Emily's elbow did not let go. The eyes that looked up at her were faded blue and absolutely steady. The eyes of a woman who had been waiting for a particular conversation for a long time, and had decided that this parking lot was where she was going to have it. "I'm Pamela Scott. Your grandmother and I went to school together there. From the 1st grade to the 12th, pleased to meet you, Mrs. Scott." "You hush. Sit down a minute." Mrs. Scott pointed at the green metal bench outside the IGA. Emily sat. The paper bags went between her feet. Mrs. Scott sat down beside her with the precision of a woman who had earned every joint she still had. "I heard you been digging. Word travels. This is Henderson, honey. Word doesn't travel. Word lives here." Emily almost smiled. Mrs. Scott did not. "You listen to me now. Your grandmother was the best woman I ever knew. The best. You hear me? Whatever she kept, whatever she didn't tell, whatever your mama wouldn't come back to see her for. All of it, every single piece of it. Your grandmother kept it because she loved somebody. Not because she was bad. Emily felt her throat close. I didn't say she was bad, I know you didn't. I'm saying it because I lived in this town for 78 years, and I know what people are going to say to you in the next 6 months. And I want you to remember that I told you first. That woman loved somebody, and she paid for it. She paid for it her whole life. And whatever you find in that field, you remember. Emily nodded. She could not speak. Mrs. Scott patted her elbow once, stood up, walked to a maroon stand parked 3 spots down, got in, drove away. Emily sat on the bench outside the IGA with her groceries between her feet for another 10 minutes, before she trusted herself to drive home. The wind moved through the parking lot. A bag rolled past her foot. Somewhere on the other side of the building, a screen door slammed. She drove home in the long blue dusk with the truck radio off and the windows down. And somewhere between the IGA and her own driveway, she said out loud to nobody at all the words that would carry her through the rest of the summer. Whatever I find, I'm going to remember. The Kentucky evening took the sentence the way Kentucky takes everything. Quietly, and the chain in the eastern field waited. Metrics. Word count 8,000-1. She dug for 9 more days after Pamela Scott put her hand on Emily's elbow outside the IGA. The chain kept going. The chain kept curving. The chain kept refusing to end. By the morning of the 19th day, Emily had cleared a trench that ran 110 feet east from the buried anchor. She had reached the high grass at the edge of the woods. The chain went into the tree line and did not come back out. She stood at the edge of the woods with her grandmother's spade in her hand and looked into the canopy. She could not see where the chain went. The undergrowth was too thick. The light was too green. The links disappeared under a tangle of honeysuckle and Virginia creeper and what looked like the rotted trunk of a sycamore that had gone over in some forgotten storm. She did not go in that morning. She wanted to. She did not. Because something in her, some small careful animal at the base of her spine, told her that whatever was at the other end of that chain was not going to be a thing she wanted to find alone. Not on day 19, not after 19 letters and a photograph and a tractor jolt that had started in her teeth and had not stopped there. She went back to the farmhouse. She washed her hands. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and she did the thing she had been not doing for 3 weeks. She opened the laptop. She typed into the search bar the only set of words she had that might match anything. Us Carlton. 1944. Henderson, Kentucky. The screen returned nothing. She tried again. Liberty Ship Carlton. Inland. Derailment. Nothing. She tried Carlton. Navy. Sept 15, 1944. A single article appeared. The third result down, from a regional historical society in southern Indiana. The article was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned the loss of a Liberty ship called Carlton in the North Atlantic on September 16, 1944. All hands lost, no survivors. The wreck had never been recovered. The article had been written in 1988 by a woman named Eleanor Caldwell, who had since died and whose research notes had been donated to the Indiana State Library. Emily read the article twice. A ship lost in the North Atlantic. On the morning Jonathan's train had derailed 3 miles east of Henderson Junction. A ship lost, with all hands, including, presumably, Petty Officer 3rd Class Jonathan R. Wright, Indiana boy, 20 years old, engaged to a girl in Kentucky. Emily closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table and she stared at the wall above the sink for a long time. Because the math was not adding up. Because the Navy had told one story to the wider world, and the railroad in Henderson County had been told a different story. And somewhere in the gap between those 2 stories was a hole that had been cut out of a ship and dragged inland, and a young man who had ended every letter to her grandmother with the word forever, and who, according to the United States government, had died at sea on a day when he had almost certainly died on land. She stood up. She drove into town. The Henderson County Public Library was a single-story brick building on 4th Street that had been a feed store until 1962, and had not entirely committed to being a library since. The woman at the front desk was named Linda and had been there for 28 years. She recognized Emily before Emily had finished saying hello. "You want the 1944 papers?" "I want the 1944 papers." Linda did not ask why. She walked Emily back into a small room at the rear of the building where the older bound volumes of the Henderson Gleaner were kept on metal shelves. She pulled down July through December 1944. She set them on a long table under a fluorescent light. She put her hand on the top volume for a second before she let go. The hand stayed there a beat longer than it needed to. "If you find what you're looking for," Linda said, in a voice low enough that Emily almost did not catch it. "You remember a lot of people in this county lost folks in that storm." "I will." Linda left. Emily opened the September volume. September 1, 1944. Hog prices. A revival meeting. A boy missing in a creek. September 8. Local boy promoted to corporal in France. September 15. Storm warnings posted out of Memphis. September 16. Train derailment reported near Henderson Junction. The article was 4 paragraphs long. A freight train traveling north had run off the rails approximately 3 miles east of Henderson Junction during the worst of the previous night's storm. No casualties had been reported. Naval personnel had been on the scene by sunrise. Naval personnel had declined to comment on the contents of the train. The article ended with the sentence, "The line will be reopened as soon as recovery is complete." Emily read it 3 times. She turned the page. September 17. Nothing. September 18. Nothing. September 19. A small notice on page 4. Recovery operations near Henderson Junction continue. The naval personnel involved had again declined to comment. The line had not yet reopened. There was no further information available. Emily flipped forward. September 23. The line had reopened. No mention of the train, no mention of the cargo, no mention of recovery operations. As if a freight train had derailed in the worst storm in 50 years, and the Navy had spent 8 days on the scene, and then the Henderson Gleaner had collectively decided to forget the entire incident had occurred. She turned more pages. October. Nothing. November. Nothing. December 24, 1944. A small obituary at the bottom of page 6. Robert Allen, age 23 of Henderson County, had married Miss Shirley Marie Allen at the First Methodist Church on December 22. The brief notice noted that the bride was the daughter of John W. Allen of Henderson County, and that the groom was returning to active duty in the Pacific in January. Emily read the notice twice. 3 months. 3 months between the derailment and the wedding. 3 months between Jonathan's last letter and Shirley Allen's signature on a marriage certificate to a man named Robert Allen, who had been on leave from the Pacific, and who had, very obviously, been brought in fast. Emily closed the volume. Linda was at the desk when Emily came out. Linda did not say anything. Linda just watched her go. Emily drove home in the long blue dusk with the truck radio off and the windows down, and she did the math one more time. A wedding in December, a baby in May, maybe June, a baby that would be raised by Robert Allen, who was a kind man who had been kind enough to marry a girl in a hurry, kind enough to never ask, kind enough to die quietly of pneumonia 26 years later, without anyone in the family ever speaking the truth out loud. A baby who had grown up to be Emily's grandfather, or the man Emily had always been told was her grandfather. She pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a long time before she went inside. Edward Harris was on her porch at 6 the next morning. He was sitting on the top step with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them. He was looking at the eastern corner of her property, the way a man looks at something he has spent a very long time not looking at. Emily got out of the truck, walked over, sat down on the step beside him without asking. "You read the papers, didn't you?" "I read the papers. There's somebody you ought to talk to." "Before you go any further." "Who?" "George White." "I don't know that name. Most people don't anymore." "He's 96. Lives over by the old elevator. He worked the rail yard at Henderson Junction in 44. He was 14 years old that night. He was on the platform." Edward Harris had not looked at her once since she had sat down. He was still looking at the eastern corner of the property. He said, "He's the only man left alive who saw it come off the train." Emily drove out to George White's house that same afternoon. The house was a small white bungalow with peeling paint and a wheelchair ramp that had been added at some point in the last decade. The yard had not been mowed since spring. A small American flag hung from a bracket beside the front door and had faded to the color of a child's drawing of an American flag. George White answered the door himself. He was 96 years old and built like a question mark. His eyes were the color of old denim. He looked at Emily for a long time before he stepped aside to let her in. "Edward called me," he said. "Told me you were coming, Mr. White." "Aye, George, please." "Mr. White was my father. Mr. White is a man I have not been for about 70 years. She sat on a couch in a living room that smelled like coffee and pine cleaner, and the particular dust of a house where one old man had lived alone for a very long time. George White lowered himself into an armchair across from her, with the care of a man who had counted every joint twice before he sat down. He did not offer her anything. He looked at her for a minute. He said, "Allen girl?" "Yes, sir." Looked like her around the eyes. Not the mouth. Mouth's your mother's. You knew my mother. Knew her enough. A pause. You found something out at the farm, I did. George White leaned back in the chair. He laced his fingers across his stomach. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, his voice was different. It was the voice of a man telling a story he had been telling himself in the dark for 82 years and had never told out loud to anybody. I was 14, he said. I had been working the yard for almost a year. My daddy got me on. Said the railroad would teach a boy more than the school ever would. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't right either. Doesn't matter. That night I was on the platform. Storm came in around 8. Worst storm in my life, and I have lived to 96. Sky was green. You ever seen a green sky? No, you'd remember if you had. Around midnight, the dispatcher come out on the platform looking like he'd seen something he didn't want to see. He told me to go inside and not come out. So I went inside. And I came out anyway. George White smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. A train pulled in around 1 in the morning. Wasn't on the schedule. 10 cars, maybe 11. Black, no markings, sealed. 2 flat cars at the back with tarps over whatever was on them. The tarps tied down so tight you could see the shape of the thing under them, and you could not see what it was. And there were men on that train who were not railroad men. What did they look like? Navy. Some of them in uniform, some of them not. Men with sidearms. Officers giving orders to other officers. There must have been 30 of them. They were not happy. They had been in that storm for hours, and they were not happy. What did they take off the train? George White was quiet for a long time before he answered. Don't know what they took off all of it. Wasn't my business to know. But what they took off the back 2 cars. That I saw. Because I climbed up on the freight scale to see better, and one of the men yelled at me, and I climbed back down. But I saw enough. What did you see? A chain. The biggest chain I ever saw in my life. They had it coiled on a flatbed. It took 6 men to lift the coil onto a sledge. They had mules, they had a wagon team, and they had the front end of that chain tied to something I never got a good look at because it was still on the flat car, and they had a tarp on it. But the chain was attached to it. And whatever it was big enough that the flat car springs were flat against the trucks. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand. They took it out of the yard on the old logging road that runs east, through the bottom land. Through the bottoms and up toward the Allen place. Took them almost till dawn. I came back the next day and the freight train was gone. The tarp was gone. The flat cars were gone. There was nothing in that yard that proved that train had ever been there. There were marks, though. In the road, drag marks. 12 inches deep in some places. 12 inches deep in dry road. You ever seen a drag mark 12 inches deep in dry road? I haven't, you don't forget it. He stopped. He looked at his hands. I have not spoken about this to anyone in 82 years. Why now? George White looked up at her. His denim blue eyes were perfectly clear. He said, because there's no one left to keep the secret for, child. Your grandmother is in the ground. Your great-grandfather is in the ground. The men I would have been keeping it for are all in the ground. I am the last one above ground who saw what came off that train, and I am 96, and I would rather not take it with me. Emily did not move. George White said, you go home and you finish what you started. You find what's at the end of that chain, and when you do, you call me. You hear me. You call me. Because I want to know what they brought to Henderson before I die. She nodded. She could not speak. She drove home in the long blue dusk with the truck radio off, and the windows down, and the smell of cut hay coming up off the fields on both sides of the road. And somewhere between George White's driveway and her own, she pulled the truck over to the shoulder and put her forehead on the steering wheel and stayed there for a long time, without crying or thinking, or doing anything at all. She was home by full dark. The sheriff's cruiser was parked in her driveway. The cruiser was a County Crown Vic with the lights off and the engine running. The man in the driver's seat got out as she pulled in. He was 60, tall, white-haired, built like a man who had played football in 1982 and never entirely stopped. His uniform was clean. His hat was on. He held it at his side like a man who had been raised to take his hat off indoors and was not sure yet whether the porch counted. She got out of the truck. You're Emily Moore. I am Sheriff Donald Thomas. We haven't met, we haven't. Sheriff Thomas glanced once at the eastern corner of the property. He glanced back at her. His face did not move. I had 3 different people in this county call me this week to tell me what you've been doing out here. I bet you did. You got a permit for that excavation. I'm digging on my own land, Sheriff. You're digging on land that the state of Kentucky considers historically significant the moment that anchor comes up out of the ground, which it has. Which Which makes this a different kind of conversation than one you think it is. I haven't called anyone yet. I know you haven't. That's the problem. If you'd called the State Historic Preservation Office on day one, we wouldn't be standing here. But you didn't, and now I'm standing on your porch because 3 different old men in this county woke up this morning and called my office and said the Allen girl is out there with a pickaxe, trying to dig up something that better not be dug up. By Allen girl, you mean me. By Allen girl, I mean you. A silence. Emily felt something hot move up the back of her neck. I am not going to stop digging, Sheriff. I didn't ask you to. You implied it. I made a recommendation. There's a difference. Sheriff Thomas put his hat on. He did it slowly. He looked at her from under the brim with eyes she could not read at all. He said, in a voice that did not change pitch the entire way through the sentence, there are things buried in this county that don't belong to you, Miss Moore. Don't belong to your grandmother. Don't belong to anybody alive. You go ahead and dig if you want to. But you ought to think about why 3 old men called my office before you got home from town today. And you ought to think about who told them you were home. He walked back to the cruiser. He got in, he shut the door. He sat there in the driver's seat with the engine running for a count of about 20 seconds, looking at her across the yard, before he backed out of the driveway and drove away. Emily stood on the porch until the taillights were gone. She did not move for a long time. 3 old men. 3. She went inside, locked the door, did not turn on the lights. She stood in the dark kitchen with her back against the refrigerator, and she said out loud to the empty house, "Who told them, Grandma?" The kitchen did not answer, but somewhere in the dark, on the western edge of the property, where the road bent past Edward Harris's place, Emily could see through the kitchen window the headlights of a vehicle that had pulled over to the shoulder and was not moving. The headlights stayed where they were for 10 minutes. Then they went off. Then they came on again. Then they pulled slowly out and drove away in the direction of town. Emily Moore went up to the attic that night and opened the trunk again. She did not read another letter. She did not need to. She lifted the false bottom of the trunk that she had not realized was a false bottom until that very moment, when the wood gave a little under her palm in a way it had not given the last time she had touched it. She pried the loose panel up with the screwdriver. Underneath the panel, she found a single sheet of paper folded into thirds. The paper was a hand-drawn map. The map showed the eastern corner of the property. The map showed the woods. The map showed, marked in faded pencil with a small X, a place in the woods Emily had not yet walked to. The place where on the map the chain ended, next to the X. In handwriting Emily was now beginning to know better than she knew her own. Her grandmother had written 4 words. "I'm sorry, my love." Emily folded the map. She put it in her pocket. She went downstairs. The phone rang at 6 in the morning. She picked it up because she thought it was Nicole. She thought it was Nicole, and she was finally going to answer, because she could not stand another voicemail, and she was running out of ways to be alone with what she was finding. It was not Nicole. "Mom, sweetheart, don't hang up." "I wasn't going to hang up. You haven't been answering. I've been busy, Emily. Listen to me, I'm asking you. I'm begging you. Whatever you're doing out there, stop. Sell the farm. Come home. Come back to Boston. We'll figure something out. I'll help you. I have some savings. We can, Mom. Please, Mom. There's an anchor in the eastern field. There's a chain that goes into the woods. There are letters in the attic from a man named Jonathan. Who was he? A silence. A long silence. A silence so long that Emily checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Her mother said, in a voice that did not sound like her mother's voice at all, "I promised her, Emily." "You promised who?" "Your grandmother." "You promised her what?" "I cannot. I cannot do this on the phone." "Then come down here." "I can't." "You can, Emily, Mom. I am asking you, as your daughter, as the person who is standing in your mother's kitchen looking at a photograph of her with a man I have never heard of in my life." "Who was Jonathan?" Another silence, a different silence. The silence of a woman who has spent 40 years not saying something and is realizing that the not saying has run out of road. Her mother said, "I'm coming down." "When?" "Today. I'm leaving in an hour." "I'll be there tonight, Mom." "I'm coming, Emily. Don't dig anymore, please. Just don't dig anymore until I get there." The line clicked. Emily set the phone down on the kitchen counter. She did not move. She stood in the kitchen of the woman she had barely known, and she looked at the framed photograph above the sink. The woman in the cotton dress looked back at her with that same expression. Emily had been failing to read her whole life. She was beginning to read it now. It was not smiling and not sad. It was waiting. The woman in the photograph had been waiting her whole life. For somebody. For the right somebody. for the somebody who would finally come back to the farm and dig in the eastern corner, and read the letters and follow the chain into the woods. Emily walked out of the kitchen, down the steps, across the yard, through the gate, across the long grass to the trench she had dug. She stood at the rim, she looked down at the anchor. She said to the iron, to the chain, to the 70 years of dirt that had buried both, "She's coming." The chain did not move. But somewhere east of where Emily stood, somewhere in the woods at the place, marked with an X on a map, drawn by a woman she had never properly known, somewhere where a thing nobody in her family had ever named was waiting at the end of a line her grandmother had marked. "I'm sorry, my love." Emily Moore could swear the morning air shifted, the way air shifts when something that has been still for a long time it is about to move. She went back to the house. She made coffee. She sat on the porch with the cup in her hands and watched the sun come up over the tree line at the eastern edge of her property. She waited for her mother to drive 640 miles south. She did not dig that day. She honored the only request her mother had made of her in 6 weeks. She did, however, in the late afternoon, walk into the woods alone. She did not bring the spade. She did not bring the pickaxe. She brought only the hand-drawn map from the false bottom of the trunk and a flashlight she did not yet need, and her grandmother's red bandana tied around her wrist. She walked east through the high grass. She crossed the line where her grandmother's father had stopped farming in 1944. She entered the woods. The woods were older than the farm. The trees were oak and hickory, and one enormous sycamore that had probably been a sapling when Kentucky had still been Virginia. The canopy closed over her head. The light went green. The temperature dropped 4 degrees. She followed the map. She walked for 20 minutes. She came to a place where the ground dropped away. It was not a cliff. It was not a sinkhole. It was a ravine. A long, narrow gash in the limestone bedrock where some old creek had cut down through the rock 1,000 years ago, and the rock had not yet finished giving way. The walls were maybe 20 feet high. The bottom was choked with ferns and vines, and the fallen trunks of trees that had gone over the edge during storms in the last century. Emily stood at the rim of the ravine. She looked down at the bottom of the ravine, half buried in 100 years of leaf litter and storm wash and Kentucky honeysuckle, was something that should not have been there. It was not a tree. It was not a stone. It was the corner of something rectangular. Metal. Rust blackened. Riveted along the edges in the same pattern she had seen on the buried anchor in the field behind her. Half a panel, maybe less. Sticking up out of the green floor of the ravine like a broken tooth. She could not read what was painted on it from where she stood. The paint was almost gone, but there was a word. Faded, most of the letters lost, and one number she could still see clearly because somebody had stenciled it in twice for emphasis at the bottom of the panel, in white paint over navy gray, in a font Emily had seen in war films her entire life and had never expected to see in person. The number was 7. She did not climb down into the ravine that afternoon. She stood at the rim for a long time. She did not cry. She did not pray. She did not call anyone. She turned around. She walked back through the woods. She crossed the line her grandmother's father had stopped farming at in 1944, and she walked across her own field, past the trench where the anchor was buried, and she came back to the house in the slanting light of late afternoon, and she sat on the porch step, and she waited for her mother. Brenda Wright arrived at 9:20 that night. The headlights swept across the yard. The Subaru pulled in, the engine cut. The door opened, her mother got out. Emily had not seen her mother in person since Christmas. Brenda Wright was 58 years old, slender, gray at the temples, dressed in the kind of practical traveling clothes a woman wears when she does not want anyone to remember what she was wearing. She had a small overnight bag in one hand. She had not been crying. She looked like a woman who had finished crying about 150 miles back and had decided that whatever was left was going to be done with dry eyes. She stood at the foot of the porch steps. She looked up at Emily. She said, "I haven't been on this porch in 35 years, I know. Mom, you found the trunk? I found the trunk. The letters, you read them, most of them." Brenda Wright closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, she said, in a voice that had been waiting 40 years to say what it was about to say, "Jonathan Wright was your grandfather." Emily did not move. "The man who raised your grandfather, who you have a photograph of in your wallet, who you called Grandpa Robert at every Christmas you were old enough to remember. He was a good man. He was a kind man. He loved your grandmother. But he was not her first love, and he was not the father of her child. He married your grandmother in December of 1944, because Shirley was pregnant, and the man who was supposed to marry her was dead in a ravine in the woods on the eastern edge of this farm, and nobody was ever supposed to know. The world went very quiet. Emily said, in a voice that did not sound like her own, "He died in the ravine, he died on the train. He died when the train derailed. He died in the storm. He died because the cargo he was hauling killed everyone who was hauling it, and the Navy spent 8 days getting what was left of him, and what was left of the cargo into the woods on this farm, where nobody would ever find any of it again. Including, your grandmother always believed, the part of the cargo that he had spent the last week of his life trying to make sure somebody else found out about. What was the cargo, Mom?" Brenda Wright sat down on the porch step beside her daughter. She put her face in her hands. When she looked up again, she said, in a voice that had finally, after 40 years, stopped trying to protect anyone, "Sweetheart, I am going to tell you everything, but I am going to tell you inside, and I am going to need a drink, and I am going to need you to understand that the reason I never came back here was not because I hated your grandmother. Why didn't you come back, Mom? Because I knew the day she told me that one of us was going to have to dig it up. And I did not want it to be me. And I am so sorry, Emily. I am so sorry that it ended up being you." Brenda Wright stood up. She picked up her overnight bag. She walked past her daughter and through the front door of the house her own mother had lived in alone for 35 years. And she did not look back. Because she had spent 40 years looking back at this house in her head, and she was not going to do it on the threshold tonight. Emily Moore sat on the porch for a long minute by herself. Then she stood up. She followed her mother inside. The kitchen was dark when she came in. Her mother had not turned on the overhead light. She had turned on the small yellow bulb over the sink. The corners of the room were in shadow. The refrigerator was humming the same hum it had been humming for 6 weeks. The clock above the stove was still stopped at 4:15. Brenda Wright was already at the table. She had taken down the bottle from the cabinet over the refrigerator. She had poured 2 fingers into a jelly glass. She was not drinking it, she was holding it. She was turning the glass a quarter turn at a time on the wood. The way a woman warms up to a confession she has been rehearsing in her car for the better part of a day. Emily sat down across from her. She did not pour herself one. She wanted one. She did not pour one, because she wanted to remember every word her mother was about to say, and she had a feeling that bourbon was going to make that harder. Her mother said finally, "I was 18, I know." "You don't, Emily. You know the year. You don't know what 18 meant in this house in 1986. Okay, I had just been accepted to Wellesley. I had my acceptance letter on the table right there. Right where your elbow is now. And your grandmother sat across from me where I am sitting now, and she said she had something to tell me before I left. Before I went up north. Because if I went up north without knowing, she said I would carry the wrong man's name in my head my whole life, and she could not let me leave with that." Brenda Wright stopped. She took a sip of bourbon, set the glass down, did not look at Emily. "She told me Robert Allen was not my father." Emily nodded. She had already done the math. She had done the math standing in the dark hallway on the way to the kitchen, 10 minutes ago, between her mother saying that on the porch and the kitchen light going on. She had done the math the way you do math when somebody has just dropped a load of dishes in the next room, and you are trying to count which ones are broken before you walk in. "Robert Allen was a good man, Mom. You said he was. He raised me. He raised your Uncle Bill, who you never met because he died in 1981 in Vietnam, but who was also not biologically his. He took both of us, knowing. He took your grandmother knowing. And I think, Emily, I think your grandmother loved him. I really do, in a way. The way a woman loves a man who has been kind to her for 30 years. But that is not the same as the way she loved Jonathan Wright. And the difference is what killed something in this house, slowly, over 30 years. Until Robert was a quiet man in a recliner, and your grandmother was a woman who stared out a kitchen window for the entire decade before he died. What did she tell you? About Jonathan. She told me what I am going to tell you. Most of it. Some of it I figured out later. After I left, tell me. Brenda Wright finally looked up at her daughter. She had her mother's eyes. Emily had never noticed that before, or had noticed and had refused to notice. There was a particular green in the iris that Emma in the iris had been seeing in the photograph above the radiator for as long as she had been alive, and she had never once connected it to the woman across the table from her, and now she could not unsee it. Jonathan was the son of a railroad foreman in Indiana. He met your grandmother at a county fair in 1942. He was 17, she was 16. He came back to Henderson County twice on furlough before he shipped out. They were going to be married after the war. He had written her father a letter asking for permission. Her father wrote back saying yes. The letter was in the trunk too. You didn't get to it yet. I didn't. He went to sea in March of 1944. He was on a Liberty ship out of Norfolk. He did Atlantic crossings, convoy duty. He was not supposed to come anywhere near Kentucky for the entire duration of the war. What happened? In September of 1944, his ship was reassigned to a thing that did not officially exist, a thing that had no name, a thing that was so quiet about itself that the only reason your grandmother ever knew it had existed at all was that Jonathan, in the last letter he ever wrote her, broke procedure. Because he was scared, because he had seen something, and because he knew, by then, that whatever was happening on that ship was something he did not want to carry to his grave without somebody else knowing, Mom. What was on the ship? Brenda Wright took another sip of bourbon. She set the glass down with both hands. The cargo, the official cargo, was scrap, or that's what the manifest said. Salvage steel, pulled off 2 heavy cruisers that had been damaged in the Atlantic and were too shot up to repair. The Navy was supposedly hauling the scrap inland by rail to a smelter in Indiana that the public was not supposed to know about, to recycle it, to deny the Germans the propaganda of photographing wrecked American ships at port. That was the official cargo. That was the official cargo. There was another one. There was another one. What was it? Brenda Wright did not answer for a long time. When she answered, her voice was lower than it had been all night. There were men on that ship who were not Navy. Jonathan wrote about them. He did not name them. He said in his last letter that there were men on board who did not wear uniforms, and who did not eat with the crew, and who came aboard at night with crates that the chief was told not to ask about. The crates were locked. The crates were marked with red paint. The men who came aboard with the crates also brought aboard, on at least one occasion that Jonathan saw, several other men, in handcuffs, in handcuffs, in handcuffs. Who were they? Jonathan didn't know. He thought they were prisoners. He thought, at first, that they were maybe German sailors who had been pulled out of the water from a U-boat sinking. But they did not speak German. They did not, as far as he could tell, speak any language he could place. He overheard the chief once say something about Detroit. He overheard one of the men in plain clothes refer to the prisoners as the subjects. Emily felt the back of her neck go cold. Mom, yes, are you telling me that the United States Navy was hauling prisoners up the inland route in September of 1944? I am telling you what your grandmother believed, which is what Jonathan wrote her, which is what he died with, which is what Robert Allen lived with his entire marriage and never said one word about because your grandmother begged him not to, and because he was a good man, and because he loved her enough to swallow it for 30 years. How many prisoners? Brenda Wright finally looked her daughter in the eye. 47. The word landed on the table between them and did not move. Emily heard a sound in her own head like a long radio broadcast going to static. 47. That was the number on the last page of Jonathan's last letter. He counted them. He counted them the night before the train pulled into Henderson Junction. He counted them in the hold of the ship, which was on a flat car by then, which is the only way I can explain to you what your grandmother said. Because what she said was that the ship's hold had been cut out of the ship and welded to a rail car, so that the cargo could be moved inland without ever leaving the original compartment. Which sounds insane. Which sounds like something an 18-year-old sailor would write in a letter to his girlfriend in 1944 because he was sleep-deprived and scared and out of his depth. Except that there is a chain in the field outside this house, and there is an anchor at the end of that chain, and the chain is the size that you put on the end of a ship's bow anchor. And ship's bow anchors do not detach from ships and end up on farms, unless somebody cut a piece of the ship off and put it on a train. Emily put her hands flat on the table, she said. They hauled the hold inland, they hauled the hold inland, the hold derailed, the hold derailed. In the worst storm in 50 years, 3 miles from Henderson Junction. The Navy got there before sunrise. The Navy spent 8 days at the wreck. The Navy salvaged what they could salvage. The Navy did not, your grandmother believed, salvage the men. Brenda Wright stopped. She put her hands over her face. When she lowered them, her face was wet but her voice had not changed. The men in the hold were dead. They had to have been. Jonathan was dead. The crew on the flat cars was dead. The whole train was a graveyard by the time the Navy got there. And the Navy, your grandmother believed, did the math that a country at war sometimes does. The math that says you cannot underrail this train. You cannot unhave these men on board. You cannot explain what you were doing with them in the first place. And the simplest solution, the one that did not require any new lies, was to take the wreckage and the hold and everything inside the hold and pull all of it down into the ravine in the backwoods on the Allen farm, because the Allen farm was the closest piece of private land big enough to hide it on. And the Allen patriarch was already on the Navy's payroll as a railroad subcontractor, and he was going to do what he was told. My great-grandfather, your great-grandfather. Yes, he let them, he had to. They told him what would happen to his daughter if he didn't. And then they told him what would happen to her if he ever spoke about it. And then they put a chain around the hold, and they dragged it 3 miles east in the dark, and they left it in the ravine, and they put dirt over the worst of it. And they made every man in the salvage detail sign a paper. And they got back on what was left of the train, and they pulled out of Henderson Junction before noon. And they erased the entire thing from the record. Emily heard her own voice from a long way off. The chain ran out. They couldn't get the hold all the way into the cover of the trees. The anchor man came off the front of the hold somewhere in the field. They tried to drag it the last quarter mile by mule, and they couldn't, so they left it. They buried the anchor where it was, and they buried the chain along the line it had cut into the field, and they told my great-grandfather that he was never to plow there again. And he didn't, and your grandmother didn't. And I knew, the day my mother told me at this table when I was 18, that one of us was going to have to. A silence, a real silence. The refrigerator stopped humming for a second, and then started up again. Emily said, "Why did she leave it to me?" Brenda Wright did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was the softest it had been all night, because she knew you would not be afraid. She watched you, Emily, from a distance, through Christmas cards, through the photographs I sent her 1 or 2 a year, for 30 years, even when I would not come down here. She watched you grow up. She watched you graduate. She watched you marry Kyle, and she told me on the phone the week of the wedding that he was not going to last because he had eyes that did not stay on you, and that you would come back to yourself one day after he was gone. And she said one more thing. What did she say? She said, "That girl has my stubbornness. Robert's kindness she does not have. Mine she does. And if she ever ends up on this farm, she will dig. And she will dig until she finds the bottom of it. And I am going to leave her everything I have, Brenda. Because I want her to be the one. Because she has the bones for it. And I do not, Brenda. And neither do you. And I am tired." Emily's eyes filled. She did not let them spill. She said, "She wanted me. She wanted you." The two of them sat at the kitchen table in the woman's house, and they did not say anything for a long time. The clock above the stove was still stopped at 4:15. A wind came up outside and moved through the screens. Brenda Wright reached across the table and put her hand on top of Emily's hand. Emily did not pull away. She had not let her mother put her hand on her hand since she was 16 years old. She did not pull away. In the morning they walked out to the trench together. Emily did not say anything. Brenda Wright did not say anything either. They stood at the rim and they looked down at the anchor. And Brenda Wright let out a breath she had been holding. Emily realized, since some afternoon in 1986 when her own mother had told her at a kitchen table what no 18-year-old should ever have been told. "He's down there," her mother said. "He's down there, in the ravine, in the ravine. I want to see it." "You don't have to." "I know I don't. I want to." So they went across the field. Across the line her great-grandfather had stopped farming at the autumn of 1944, through the high grass, into the woods, past the place where the canopy closed, down a deer path Brenda Wright walked like she had walked it before, which Emily realized halfway through that her mother probably had, when she was a girl. In spite of every warning her own father and her own mother had given her. They came to the rim of the ravine. Brenda Wright stood at the edge for a long moment. She said, "I came here once, when I was 7. Mama caught me. She did not whip me. She sat me down on a stump back there at the edge of the woods and she said, 'Brenda, if you ever come back here, promise me you will not come alone. Promise me you will bring somebody who loves you, so that you don't have to be alone with it. Promise me.' Did you promise?" "I promised." A long pause. Her mother said, "I waited 51 years to keep that promise." Emily reached over and took her mother's hand. They went down into the ravine together. The bottom of the ravine was cooler than the rim, 10 degrees cooler. The air had a mineral smell to it, the kind of smell wet limestone gives off when no sun has reached it for half a century. Ferns brushed Emily's knees. Honeysuckle pulled at her hair. A bobwhite called once from the brush above them and did not call again. They stood in front of the panel. The navy gray paint was almost gone. The number 7 was still there in white. The corner of the hold rose up out of the ravine floor at a tilted angle, like a broken corner of a coffin shoved up through a grave. Emily put her hand on it. The metal was colder than it had any business, being on a July morning in Kentucky. She walked a slow perimeter around it. She found the edge where the panel ended and the dirt began. She found the seam where 2 plates were welded together. She found, on the far side of the panel, what she had come down for, a small door. It had been a service hatch, about the size of a kitchen window. The hatch was warped on its hinges and rust had welded it half open. There was room enough, just barely, to get a hand inside. Brenda Wright did not stop her. Emily got down on her knees. She put her hand inside the hatch. The space beyond was dark. Her fingers closed on something cold and metallic and roughly cylindrical. She drew it out into the green light of the ravine. It was a small metal box, about the size of a hardback book, rusted shut. There was an eagle stamped on the lid. Below the eagle, 2 words, UNAV. Brenda Wright knelt in the leaves beside her daughter. The 2 of them looked at the box together. Emily worked the lid up with the screwdriver she had brought in her back pocket. Because she had known, the moment she had decided to walk down into the ravine, that she was going to find a box, the lid came up. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, was a single bundle of papers. The oilcloth had done its job. The papers inside were brown at the edges but still legible. Emily lifted them out with both hands. The top sheet was a typed manifest, naval letterhead. The date was September 15, 1944. The header read, Operation Island Drift, Restricted. That only. Below the header was a list, 47 names, ranks and service numbers. United States Army, United States Marines, United States Navy, American boys, American soldiers, American prisoners. The column at the far right of the manifest was headed SDC, subseptic number. Each of the 47 names had a number from 1 to 47 next to it. The header at the bottom of the page read, All listed personnel are confirmed deceased per Medical Research Protocol P7. Bodies and associated materials are to be disposed of per attached addendum. Emily read it twice, then a third time. Her mother was reading over her shoulder. Brenda Wright said, in a voice Emily had never heard from her in her life, "Oh my God." Emily turned the page. The addendum was 3 pages long. It described, in the clipped Navy prose of an officer who had been told not to make anybody feel anything, the protocol by which 47 American servicemen had been removed from various holding facilities between June and September of 1944, transported via the Liberty ship Carleton, and used as test subjects for medical research. The addendum referred to as Battlefield Survival Studies, Class 3. The research had been authorized at a level the document did not name. The research had been conducted at sea by men, the document referred to only as the research detail. The research detail did not wear Navy uniforms. The research detail did not eat with the crew. The research detail brought aboard, at night, in crates marked with red paint, equipment and supplies the manifest did not itemize. Battlefield Survival Studies, Class 3 had ended on the morning of September 15, 1944. All 47 subjects were listed as deceased. The bodies, per the addendum, were to be disposed of by burial at sea. But the Carleton had been turning inland. The Carleton had been turning inland because the bodies could not be buried at sea. Because somebody, somewhere in the chain of command, had decided that the bodies of 47 American servicemen who had been quietly removed from holding facilities and quietly experimented on for 90 days could not be buried at sea, where currents and fishing nets and the Atlantic Ocean might do what oceans do, which is bring things up. The bodies were being hauled inland for disposal. The bodies and the section of the ship's hold they had died in, and every piece of equipment the research detail had used on them. The whole compartment to be cut from the ship, welded to a flat car, hauled 3 states inland, dragged east of a railhead in Henderson County, Kentucky, and buried on a private farm whose owner had been pressured into compliance and could be relied upon to remain silent. Emily lowered the papers. She looked at her mother. Her mother was crying, not loudly, just steadily. A woman who had carried 40 years of half a story and was now finding out, in a ravine in the woods behind her childhood home, that the half she had not been told was worse than the half she had. They were American boys, Brenda Wright said. They were American boys. Mama. Emily reached for her mother, held her. The 2 of them sat in the green floor of the ravine with the box between them and the manifest of 47 names in Emily's lap, and they did not move for a long time. Then Emily put the manifest back in the box. She closed the lid. She stood up. She said, "We are going to take this home." Yes, we are going to scan every page. We are going to make copies. We are going to send the copies to a historian. We are going to send the copies to the Associated Press. We are going to send the copies to the Veterans Administration and to the National Archives and to every newspaper that will take a phone call. We are going to do it tomorrow. Mom, yes, you are going to do it with me. Brenda, Wright stood up. She wiped her face. She said, I am going to do it with you. They climbed up out of the ravine. The light at the rim was harder than it had been at the bottom. The trees moved in a wind that had not been there 20 minutes earlier. Emily carried the box against her chest. Her mother walked ahead of her on the deer path back toward the field. They did not speak the whole way back across the property. They put the box on the kitchen table. They sat down on opposite sides of it. They looked at it for a long time. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and laid a long, pale rectangle across the wood. The box was in the center of the rectangle. The eagle on the lid caught the light. Brenda Wright said, Finally, what now? Now I make some calls. Who do you call first? Emily thought about it. She did not think about it for long. She said, I call the archives. She picked up her phone. She did the search. She found the public number for the National Archives reference desk in College Park, Maryland. She dialed. She got transferred 3 times. She got, on the 4th transfer, a woman whose voice was older than the previous 3 voices, and slower and steadier, and who introduced herself as Dr. Deborah White, senior researcher in declassified naval records. Emily said her name, said where she was calling from, said the words Operation Inland Drift. There was a silence on the line, a long one. Dr. Deborah White said, in a voice that had gone, Very careful, Miss Moore. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Do not let those documents out of your sight. Do not send them by mail. Do not photograph them and post the photographs anywhere. I am getting in my car. I am driving down. I will be there tomorrow afternoon. Okay, how big is the file? About 40 pages. Are there names? 47? Another silence. Dr. White said, I have been waiting for this phone call for 31 years. She hung up. Edward Harris came up the gravel road in the dark on foot that night. He carried something under his arm, a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox. He came up the porch steps without being invited, and he sat down on the porch swing in the dark beside Emily and her mother. He did not say anything for almost a full minute. He said, My daddy was in the salvage detail. Brenda Wright went still. He was 21 years old that night. He was a railroad man like his daddy was. They drafted him into the detail because he was strong, and because he could keep his mouth shut. He carried the chain. He carried part of the chain. He helped drag the hold 3 miles east. He helped bury it. He signed the paper. He came home 4 mornings after the storm with mud on his boots and dirt under his fingernails, and he did not eat dinner with us for a week, and my mama did not ask why. Edward Harris's voice was low. He kept the secret his whole life. He kept it from my mother. He kept it from me. He kept it until 1991 when he was dying of liver cancer in the back bedroom of the house I'm sitting next door to right now, and he called me into the room, and he gave me this box, and he said, Eddie, if anybody ever comes looking, I am giving this to you. I cannot give it to anybody else. I have not been able to give it to anybody else for 47 years, and that is a long time to carry a thing like this. You take it, you wait, and if nobody comes, you put it in the ground with me, and if somebody comes, you give it to them. He held the box out. He said, Nobody came. For 33 years, nobody came. Then you came, Emily, and I have been carrying this box around the house for the last month, trying to decide if you were the one. And I knew last week when Sheriff Thomas pulled into your driveway and you didn't back down to him on your own porch, that you were. Emily took the box. She did not open it on the porch. She brought it inside. She set it on the kitchen table next to the navy box from the ravine. She opened it. Inside, in Edward Harris's father's hand, in pencil that had faded but had not failed, was a list, 47 names. The same 47 names. But this list was different. This list had been written by a man who had stood in the dark and watched a hold being dragged east, and had decided, at 21 years old, that he was going to copy down what he had seen, even if it took him the rest of his life to figure out what to do with it. There were notes next to the names, hometowns, units, in a few cases what state a wife had lived in. A few of the names had small crosses penciled next to them. Edward Harris's father had checked. He had checked. For the rest of his life he had checked. He had been looking for the families. He had not been able to find them on his own, because the Navy had erased everything. But he had kept the list. He had kept the list for 47 years, hoping, and when he had been dying he had given it to his son, and his son had carried it for another 33 years. Emily looked up at Edward Harris. She said, "Thank you." Edward Harris's blue eyes were wet. He said, "It is the right thing. It has been the right thing for 80 years. He went home. Emily and her mother sat at the kitchen table with the two boxes between them for a long time after he left, the two lists side by side. The Navy's typed manifest in front of Brenda. The railroad foreman's son's penciled copy in front of Emily. Brenda Wright said, "Two old men in this county carried this their whole lives, and neither one of them knew about the other, Edward's father. And George White, neither one of them knew, and we don't know how many more there are." "No." Emily looked at her mother. She said, "There are more." Brenda Wright nodded. She said, "There are always more." Dr. Deborah White arrived the next afternoon in a silver Honda with two cardboard archive boxes in the back seat and a manila folder in her lap. She was 62 years old. White hair cut short. A pair of reading glasses on a chain around her neck. A button-down shirt that had been ironed, and a pair of khakis that had not. She got out of the car in the driveway and she stood for a long minute, looking at the eastern corner of the property, where the trench led off toward the woods. Emily came down off the porch. Deborah White looked at her. She said, "I expected somebody older. I get that a lot lately. How long have you been at this?" 6 weeks since the plow caught, and before that I was an accountant in Boston." Deborah White smiled. A small smile. A tired smile. The smile of a woman who had spent her career being told her research interests were marginal, and who was about to be unmarginal in a way she had not let herself imagine for 31 years. She said, "May I see the documents?" "You may." They went inside. Deborah White read the manifest at the kitchen table for 40 minutes without speaking. She read the addendum. She read the railroad foreman's son's list. She turned each page with 2 fingers at the corner. She made small marks in pencil on a yellow legal pad on her lap. When she finished, she set the last page down. She took off her reading glasses. She said, "Miss Moore, Emily, what you have here is the most complete documentation of an Operation Inland Drift event that has ever surfaced. There have been rumors. There have been partial documents. There have been 3 or 4 oral histories I have collected from elderly Navy enlisted men over the last 20 years that hinted at something like this. There has never been a manifest. There has never been a body count. There has never been a location. There is now. A pause. She said, "I want to be honest with you about what is going to happen next. Please, the story is going to break. Whether you call the AP tomorrow or whether the sheriff's office leaks it next week, it is going to break, because too many people now know. Edward Harris knows. His father's list is real. Sheriff Thomas knows, or at least suspects, and his grandfather may have been involved as well. George White knows. Pamela Scott knows enough to have warned you in a parking lot. The widow of the dispatcher at Henderson Junction is probably still alive, and is probably 92, and is probably waiting to die before she opens her mouth. The number of people in this county who know frabs of this is in double digits. It is going to break. I want it to break. I know you do. I am telling you what is going to happen so that you can be right ready. Once this is in the wire services, once it is on the front page of the New York Times, once the families of the 47 start to be located, you are going to be the face of this. The granddaughter who found the manifest. The granddaughter of one of the dead. The accountant from Boston who came home and dug it up. The press is going to want you. The Navy is going to want to talk to you. The Department of Defense is going to want to talk to you. Some of the talking is going to be friendly. Some of it is not going to be friendly, I understand. I do not think you do. Tell me." Deborah White folded her hands on the table. She said, "When I was 31 years old, I was a junior researcher at the archives, and I made the mistake of mentioning Operation Inland Drift in a paper I gave at a conference in 1993. The paper was based on a single line in a single declassified document. The line said Operational Unit Designation Inland Drift was retired Nov 1944. See File 73B. File 73B does not exist. I read the line out loud at the conference. I asked the room whether anyone had ever encountered a similar designation. 3 weeks later, I was told my contract would not be renewed. I spent the next 4 years cleaning the offices of a research firm in Bethesda before I got hired back at the archives by a different supervisor under a different administration. I do not tell that story to anybody. I have not told it to anyone in 20 years. I am telling it to you so that you understand that this story has teeth. It still has teeth. Even now, even after 80 years, Emily nodded. She said, "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to do what you said you were going to do. Call the Associated Press. Call the Veterans Administration. Call the National Archives Reference Desk in writing. Call the office of the senator from Kentucky. Do it all in the same day. Make it impossible for anyone to put it back in the ground. Make the story so large by the end of the first week that no one part of the government can quietly take it apart. Okay, and then go to ground. For about 2 months. Don't give interviews. Don't appear on television. Don't take meetings with anyone who is not federal law enforcement or a credentialed reporter from a paper of record. Let the families speak. Let the historians speak. Let the records speak. You don't have to be the face of this. You only have to be the one who found it. Okay. Deborah White looked at her for a long second. She said, "Your grandmother left this to a stubborn woman." Good. This will take stubbornness. But it will also take a woman who knows how to take cover when the wind comes up. And the wind is going to come up, Emily said. I know how to take cover, Dr. White. Deborah White nodded. She said, "Then we go to work." The story broke on a Tuesday. The Associated Press ran it on the wire at 6 in the morning. By 7, it was on every wire service in the country. By noon, Emily Moore's phone had received 417 calls, and her grandmother's farm had 3 news vans at the foot of the driveway. Sheriff Donald Thomas had driven up in his cruiser, parked it sideways across the gravel to block the news vans, and gotten out and walked up the porch steps with his hat in his hand and his eyes wet. He stood in front of Emily on the porch. He said, "My grandfather signed the paper. He told my father on his deathbed in 1968. My father told me when I made sheriff in 2004. I have been the sheriff of this county for 22 years, and I have been sitting on a name I was told to sit on. Miss Moore, I am sorry I came up your driveway the way I came up your driveway last month." Emily looked at him. She said, "Sheriff, there were a lot of men in a lot of houses in this county who carried this and who shouldn't have had to." He nodded. He said, "I'd like to help. If you would let me." She let him. By the end of the first week, the AP had picked up the story in 73 regional papers. The New York Times ran a front-page piece on Wednesday. The Washington Post ran a longer feature on Friday. NPR did an 8-minute segment on Morning Edition on Monday. The CBS Evening News sent a producer to the gate at the end of Emily's driveway, and Emily, on Deborah White's advice, sent the producer away with a small wave from the porch and a refusal to come down. The Department of Veterans Affairs opened a formal inquiry on the Thursday of the second week. The Department of Defense issued a brief statement on the Friday of the second week. The statement neither confirmed nor denied the existence of Operation Inland Drift. The statement said that all records pertinent to the events of September 1944 would be reviewed for declassification. The Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs scheduled hearings for October. By the end of the second month, the first 3 families had been located. A widow in Pittsburgh, 89 years old, who had been told in 1944 that her husband had been killed in action in the Pacific. A daughter in Sacramento, born after her father had shipped out, who had never had a body to bury. A grandson in a small town in Maine, whose grandfather had been listed as missing for 80 years. The first family to come to Kentucky was the Sacramento daughter. Her name was Olivia Kane. She was 81 years old. She had silver hair and she walked with a cane, and she stood in the eastern field on the Allen farm, with Emily and Brenda Wright on either side of her. She put her hand on the anchor. She did not say anything for a very long time. Then she said, "Hello, Daddy." Emily did not cry until she heard that. Then she cried. She cried for Olivia Kane's father, whose name was Corporal William James Kane of the United States Army, whose service number was on a list in a metal box that had been sealed in a ravine for 80 years, whose daughter had grown up in Sacramento not knowing what had happened to him, whose daughter was now standing in a field in Kentucky talking to a piece of iron. She cried for her own grandmother, for Shirley Allen, who had loved a boy in 1944 and had watched the Navy take him away, and had then watched the Navy bury him in her father's woods, and had spent the next 70 years living in a house above the bones of 47 men, whose families did not know where their boys had ended. She cried for Robert Allen, who had been kind enough to marry a girl in a hurry, and had been kind enough to raise another man's child, and had been kind enough to die quietly without ever saying a word. She cried for her mother, who had carried half the story for 40 years, and had refused the whole time to set it down in front of her daughter because she had been afraid she would set down the wrong half. She cried for herself, for the woman she had been 6 months earlier in a 6th-floor walk-up in Alston, who had not known a single one of these names, who had not known she had a grandfather she had never been told about, who had not known what her grandmother had been waiting for. She cried until Olivia Kane reached out with her free hand and took Emily's hand. Olivia Kane said, in a voice that was as steady as anything Emily had heard in months, honey. Thank you. You brought my daddy home, Emily said. I didn't bring him home, Mrs. Kane. He was always here. Olivia Kane shook her head. She said, you let me come and find him. That is bringing him home. By the end of the year, 29 of the 47 families had been found. The Navy issued a public apology in March. The President of the United States issued a written statement in April. The Senate hearings, which had been scheduled for October, were extended into February and then into May. 6 surviving members of various 1944 naval administrative offices testified, all in their 90s, all visibly relieved to be finally testifying. None of them had been part of the research detail. None of them had ever known the names of the men who had been. The men who had been were almost certainly dead. The men who had ordered them were certainly dead. The bureaucratic infrastructure that had authorized them was, by any reasonable accounting, a thing that had existed for a few months in 1944, and had been dismantled the day after the Carleton had been reported lost at sea. Operation Inland Drift had operated for 107 days. In that time, 47 American servicemen had been quietly moved from their holding facilities under the cover of administrative reclassification. They had been brought aboard the Liberty ship Carleton. They had been kept in a single sealed compartment in the ship's main hold. They had been used as test subjects for survival research that, the Senate hearings would eventually conclude, had been authorized by a special committee whose records had been destroyed and whose members had been moved to other duties before the war ended. 47 men, 29 of them, now had names again. Names their families could speak. Names their families could put on stones. The Quiet Acre. All 40 acres of it was donated by Emily Moore to the National Park Service in May, and was dedicated as the Operation Inland Drift Memorial Site on a Saturday afternoon in October. 14 months after the day Emily's plow had first caught on something hard, the memorial was simple, a granite wall set into the eastern edge of the property. 47 names carved into the stone. A 48th name was carved at the bottom, smaller, in a different hand. Petty Officer 3rd Class Jonathan R. Wright. Below his name, 4 words he tried to tell. Brenda Wright stood next to her daughter at the dedication. She wore a cotton dress, pale blue. She had not worn a dress in 20 years. Her hair was pinned up the way her mother had pinned hers. She was crying. She did not try to hide it. Edward Harris was there. Pamela Scott was there in a wheelchair. Her granddaughter had pushed up the dirt path from the gate. Sheriff Donald Thomas was in uniform at parade rest near the road. Deborah White stood at the back with her hands folded. George White, 97 years old and barely upright, sat in a folding chair at the front row. And when the names were read aloud, in alphabetical order, he stood up for all of them, all 47, and then for Jonathan. Emily did not give the speech she had been asked to. She had declined. She gave the granite to the boys whose mothers and wives and daughters had never gotten to bury them, and she did not put her own face in front of the cameras, because the story was not hers, and never had been, and never would be. Olivia Kane gave the speech. She stood at the lectern in the eastern field in Henderson County, Kentucky, with the granite wall behind her and the anchor on its low concrete base to her left, and she read, in a voice steadied by 81 years of practice at speaking around grief, a single page of remarks that she had written herself. She said, in part, my father was 26 years old when he was taken. I was 3 months old. My mother died in 1981, not knowing where he was. I have lived for 43 years in the silence the United States Navy chose for my family. I am not standing here today because I have forgiven that silence. I am standing here today because a young woman in Kentucky decided that her family was done with silence. And because her grandmother, who I never met, decided 70 years ago that one of her descendants would be brave enough to finish what she could not. We do not know each other, the families of these 47 boys. We have only met because of what was found in this field. But we are bound now by something that was buried, and by the woman who refused to leave it buried. She paused. She said, thank you, Emily Moore. Thank you, Shirley Allen. Thank you for bringing my daddy home. The wind moved across the field. The granite caught the light. Emily Moore stood at the back of the small assembled crowd with her mother's hand in hers, and she watched Olivia Kane step down from the lectern, and she watched the families of the 47 walk one by one to the wall. She did not move from the back. She let them have it. She stayed in Kentucky. She did not go back to Boston. She turned the farmhouse into a small archive. She kept the trunk in the attic. She kept her grandmother's spade leaning against the porch. She kept the framed photograph of the young woman in the cotton dress on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. She added, next to it, a second photograph, a black and white photograph. The young woman in the cotton dress and the young man in the navy uniform, his arm around her waist, both of them looking at each other in a way that nobody had ever looked at Emily in her entire life, and that Emily had stopped needing anybody to look at her, because something in her had decided to look at other people that way instead. Edward Harris helped her clear the second guest room and turn it into a small reading room for visiting family members and researchers. Pamela Scott taught her how to make her grandmother's cornbread, the way her grandmother had made it, with a cast-iron skillet that had been on the farm since 1939 and that Pamela had picked up off the kitchen counter on her third visit and pointed at and said that right there, that was Shirley's mama's. You use that. Sheriff Donald Thomas stopped by once a month, not in uniform, with a six-pack of beer. They sat on the porch and they did not talk about the salvage detail. Deborah White came up from Maryland twice a year and stayed for a long weekend each time. She slept in the small upstairs bedroom that had once been Brenda's. She read in the kitchen. She walked the property in the mornings with her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Brenda Wright sold the house in Boston in February. She moved her clothes and her books and the framed photographs from the Boston hallway into the back bedroom of the farmhouse in Kentucky in March. She did not say she was moving in. Emily did not ask. They simply lived together, the way two women can live together when one is the daughter and one is the mother, and both have agreed, finally, that the geography that had separated them for 35 years was a geography they were blood-eye with. In the second spring after the dedication, on a morning in late April that was warm enough to leave the kitchen window open, Brenda Wright came down the stairs and sat at the kitchen table where her own mother had told her, in 1986, the half of the story that had cost her 35 years of her life. She said, Yes, I went up to the attic last night, did you? I read the rest of the letters. A pause. Brenda Wright said, there were 21, not 19. 2 of them were under the false bottom of the trunk. I think Mama hid those 2 on purpose. The very last 2, Emily set down her coffee. What did they say? The first one was the letter your great-grandfather wrote to Jonathan giving him permission to marry Mama. It was nicer than I would have expected. He was a hard man, your great-grandfather, but that letter was not hard. He told Jonathan he was proud to give his daughter to a man who had her kind of stubbornness. And the second was written by Jonathan. A silence. Brenda Wright reached into the pocket of her cardigan and brought out a folded piece of onion skin paper. She set it on the table between them. She said, I wanted you to read it. I wanted us to read it together. Emily took the paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Jonathan's. The same handwriting from the trunk. The same handwriting from the back of the photograph. But this letter was shorter than any of the others, 3 paragraphs, and it was dated September 15, 1944, the morning of the storm. My dearest Shirley, if you are reading this, then I did not get to the farm. I knew this morning when the chief came down to the hold and would not look me in the eye that I was probably not going to get to the farm. I have 1 piece of paper left and 10 minutes before they call us to move the cargo to the train. I am writing this fast and I am giving it to a sailor named Tom Bishop, who has promised to mail it from the railhead. Tom Bishop is a good man. If this letter reaches you, it is because Tom Bishop also made it through the storm. I love you. I have loved you since the fair in 1942. I will love you whether or not I get to walk to the farm tonight. I am sorry that I am not going to be there to make a life with you. I am sorry that you are going to have to make a life without me. I am asking you, my darling, to make one anyway. Make one with whatever is left of you after this. Marry a man who is kind. Have a daughter. Tell the daughter, when she is old enough, that she had a father who tried to do a right thing in a wrong place. And then, my darling, please live. Please live for both of us. I will be in the field tonight, one way or another. If they let me come to the farm, I will come. If they do not let me come, I will be wherever they put me. I am writing this so you know that wherever they put me, I will still be yours. Forever. Jonathan. Emily lowered the letter. She did not speak. She could not. Brenda Wright said, in a voice that was the gentlest Emily had ever heard from her, he told her. He told her to live. He told her to have a daughter. He told her to tell that daughter. And she did. She did. She had me. She told me in this kitchen when I was 18. She did exactly what he asked. And then I did not do exactly what she asked. I did not tell you. I waited. I waited until you found it yourself. And I am sorry, Em. I am sorry I waited. Emily reached across the table. She took her mother's hand. She said, "Mom, you waited because she waited. And she waited because she was afraid. And we are done being afraid now." A pause. Emily said, "We are done." Brenda Wright nodded. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the last year and a half to last her the rest of her life. But she did fold her other hand over Emily's hand, and she sat there in the kitchen of the woman she had spent 35 years not being able to come home to, and she did not let go. On a Saturday in November of the second year, with a soft snow falling, and the eastern field iron gray, and the memorial wall beginning to weather in the way granite weathers, Emily Moore walked out to the wall with a single dried wildflower in her hand. She set the wildflower at the base of the wall. She put her palm flat against the granite, against the name carved at the bottom, Petty Officer 3rd Class Jonathan R. Wright. She said in a voice the wind took, "Grandpa, I'm Emily, I came back." The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the field. A whippoorwill called once from the woods. The chain in the field was gone. The Park Service had pulled it up in July. The anchor was gone too, mounted now as the centerpiece of the memorial on a low concrete base under a clear winter sky. The hold was preserved where it had lain for 80 years, and the remains of 47 American servicemen had been respectfully exhumed, identified by the science the Navy of 1944 had not had, and returned to families that had spent generations not knowing. 3 women in Emily's family had carried this story. Shirley Allen had carried it because she had loved a man enough to outlive him for 70 years. Brenda Wright had carried it because she had promised her mother she would. Emily Moore had carried it because somebody had to take it down off the women in her family at last and set it down, openly, in a field in Kentucky, so that other families could pick up what belonged to them. "There is a kind of inheritance," Emily had said once, late in an interview with a small public radio station in Owensboro, "that is not made of money or land or jewelry or china. It is made of silence, and the only way you ever pay it forward is by breaking it." She walked back to the farmhouse in the snow. Her mother was on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. They sat in the swing together. They did not talk for a long time. They watched the eastern corner of the property in the gray winter light. Brenda Wright said, "She would be proud of you, baby." Emily said, "She'd be proud of us." They drank their coffee. The snow came down harder. A car came slowly down the gravel road and stopped at the foot of the driveway. A small sedan with Pennsylvania plates. A man got out of the driver's side. He looked at the house. He looked up at the porch. He raised a hand slowly, like a man who was not sure he was at the right place. Emily set her coffee down. She stood up. She said, "Mom, I see him." The man came up the gravel walk with his hat in his hand. He was maybe 70, white hair, a long, thin face. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at Emily. He said, "Miss Moore, my name is Andrew Kane. I am Olivia's son. My grandfather is one of the men on the wall. I have driven from Pittsburgh because my mother passed last month, and she asked me, before she passed, to come down here in person and bring you something." Emily came down the steps. She did not ask what he had brought. She did not need to. She could see, in his free hand, a small flat box. The kind of box that holds a single folded letter. Andrew Kane held the box out. He said, "My mother wrote it the week after she came down for the dedication. She wanted you to have it. She did not want to send it in the mail. She made me promise." Emily took the box. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Kane?" He nodded. He looked past her, at the eastern corner of the property, where the granite wall stood in the snow with the 47 names and the 1 name at the bottom. He said, "I'm going to walk out to the wall if that's all right." "Of course it's all right." He walked out across the yard, through the snow, out to the field, out to the wall. Emily watched him go. He stood at the wall for a long time. He did not move. The snow gathered on his shoulders and on his hat. Emily turned the small box over in her hands. She opened it. Inside was a folded piece of stationery. Pale blue. Olivia Kane's handwriting on the front to Emily Moore. "To be read on the porch with your mother in the winter." Emily looked at her mother. Brenda Wright said, "Open it, honey." Emily opened it. She read it out loud, in the snow, on the porch, on the farm her grandmother had left her. "Dear Emily, I am writing this in a hotel room in Owensboro because I could not bring myself to write it on the airplane. The dedication was today. I held your hand. I touched the granite. I said hello to my daddy for the first time in 81 years. I want you to know something that I did not say at the lectern. I did not say it because I did not want to make you cry in front of all of those people. When I was a child in Sacramento, my mother used to tell me a story about my father. She said that on the morning he shipped out, he turned around at the gangway and ran back to her and put his hand on her belly because I was in there and he had not been able to feel me yet. And he said to her, 'Polly, if it is a girl, Name her Olivia. Tell her I loved her before I met her. I never met him. I was 3 months old. But I want you to know, Emily, that when you found him, when you brought us to that field, when you put his name on a wall in Kentucky next to 46 other boys who had also been somebody's father or husband or son, when you did that, you did for him what he asked my mother to do for me on the day he shipped out. You loved him before you met him. I do not know how to thank you for that. I do not know how to thank your grandmother. I do not know how to thank your mother. I do not know how to thank the small kind woman in the photograph who wore a cotton dress in 1944 and waited 70 years for somebody to come back to the farm. But I am going to tell you something my mother told me. The night before she died, the last sentence she said to me before the morphine took her under for good. She said, Olivia, the people who love us across time, not just inside it. You loved your grandfather across time, Emily. He loved you back. I am old. I will not see you again. But I wanted you to know, and I wanted your mother to know, that the women in your family did a thing in this world that women have been doing in this world quietly since the world began. They kept a love alive that nobody else was going to keep alive. And then, when it was time, they handed it down. Take good care of the wall. Take good care of your mother. Take good care of yourself. With all my love, Olivia. Emily lowered the letter. She did not speak. She did not need to. Brenda Wright was holding her hand again. Out across the yard in the gray winter field, Andrew Kane was walking slowly back from the granite wall toward the porch. The snow was falling more heavily now. The whippoorwill called again from the woods. The chain in the field had been gone for months. The anchor was on its concrete base. The hold was preserved in the ravine. The boys had names again. All 48 of them. And the women in Emily Moore's family had finally, after 80 years, set down what they had been carrying. It is a strange thing, you know, to find out that you are descended not from the man you thought, but from a boy of 19, who tried in the last week of his life to do the right thing. It is a stranger thing to find out that the woman you barely knew, the woman you had been told was cold and distant and impossible to love, had spent every single day of her 70 years on the wrong side of telling because somebody had to be the one to keep it, until somebody else could be the one to let it go. And it is the strangest thing of all to find out that the somebody who lets it go is you. Have you ever wondered, dear listener, how many women in your own family, how many quiet, gray-haired, careful women, sitting in kitchens you have not visited in too long, looking out windows at fields you have never seen, are sitting on stories they have been waiting their whole lives to put down? How many of them are waiting, right now, for one of us to walk in and ask, not to judge them, not to fix them, only to listen, only to lift the iron off them at last, and carry it the rest of the way to where it can finally lie still? If you have a story like Emily's in your own family, a grandmother who carried something, a mother who promised, a name in the back of a drawer that nobody ever explains, we would love to hear it. Tell us in the comments below. Your story might be the one that helps somebody else find theirs. The eastern field is quiet now, the chain settled. 3 generations of women settled with it, and the boys came home.